Suzanne Anker is a visual artist and also a theorist working at the intersection of art and biology. In her practice, she investigates the ways in which nature is being altered in the 21st century. She's concerned with genetics, with climate change, species extinction, and toxic degradation, and calls attention to the beauty of life and the cyclicality of nature. Anker frequently works with a range of materials, from botanical specimens to medical museum artifacts, laboratory apparatus, microscopic images, and geological specimens. She works in a variety of mediums, ranging from digital sculpture and installation to large-scale photography to plants grown by LED lights. Her work has been shown in museums and galleries all over the world. So I'm really excited to be discussing your work with you today. I'd love to hear what you're working on at the moment.
Well, at the moment, I'm working on a series of work called After Eden. It has to do with the fact of the way in which we are going to be living post-pandemic, which is completely unclear. There is no new normal. There will be no new normal. There will be a series, in my opinion, of adjustments made because we now have realized that we live in the digital revolution coupled with a global expanse of the world. And these two entities are changing everything we're doing, from our working habits to our shopping habits to the way we interface with friends, et cetera, et cetera. So there is no new normal, okay? There is post-pandemic issues which we will have to deal with. And there's a very good book by Fareed Zakaria. It's an audiobook as well as a textbook, and it's called 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. I have been listening to that, and he has been talking about our patterns of life being reconfigured.
Very interesting. I'm coming at this from a research background, and in my research I was really interested in sort of art and science and what they have to offer each other. So in this post-pandemic situation, do you think that relationship will change?
I think everything will change, and I think that the issues of post-enlightenment thinking, meaning the kinds of eruption of rationality now, will continue to partner with the kinds of excesses of innovation. I think because we now live in the cut and paste society, that the relationship between oppositions will really be changed. And I think that I like to kind of see art and science in a more triangular way, to include social science, or sociology or anthropology or philosophy, etc. Because it's not about the either or. It really is about how that kind of information or ideas affect public policy and society at large.
Yeah, definitely. And I sort of value that perspective. One thing that I really noticed during my research, I was interviewing a lot of scientists about something very different, not about the pandemic, but I noticed that there was a lot of resistance from within science to any kind of involvement in sort of what are deemed unscientific aspects of their work. So, creative thinking, feeling, social aspects of the job, policy, anything along those lines. And it seems that, I'm sure your project will be a case in point, that the arts are going to be hugely important to understanding how science can be used, should be used in this new world. So What are your views on that? What does art have to offer?
Well, I think not only what art has to offer, because it operates with different tools. Okay. It does not translate information into numerical coefficients. It has another function, becoming a data bank, the ideas that were present in the cultural imaginary of that time. So if we go back to any period in art history, whether it's through the Middle Ages or the Renaissance or even Cubism, etc., we see that the art is a parallel reflection, a visual reflection of what was happening in the scientific slash engineering slash industrial world at that time. But it uses other factors. It can use hyperbole, it can use exaggeration, it can use humor, irony, it can also be a social critique of what is happening. And I think that it makes visible the invisible the same way that science makes visible the invisible, except it is doing it in other ways. So for every scientific accomplishment, there's a parallel artistic practice that goes on. And I think that we can take many cases in point. For example, we can look at the way accident and recognition are two aspects that are extremely important in both art and science. An example would be someone like Alexander Fleming, who went away for the weekend, leaving his Petri dishes uncovered and the window to his laboratory open. And when he came back, he saw that there was a fungus around one of the staph infections that was the impetus for him to then create penicillin. Now, another scientist working strictly by scientific methodology may not have recognized that as an aspect. And there are many cases like this. The vulcanization of rubber, for example, when a piece of rubber that the scientist was holding accidentally fell on the hot stove. That's how we got vulcanization of rubber. Another example are mirror neurons. So these issues of recognition go beyond the traditional numerical code of science. And if they can be repeated, then of course they enter into the lexicon of the scientific literature. Art is a bit different in sense that although it relies on recognition as well, it's not about repeatability. Okay? It is about a kind of unique formulation that has multiple meanings simultaneously. And so, in itself, art is a contradiction, whereas in science, contradictions really do not perform very well.
But I love this parallel that you're drawing and the similarity that you're pointing to, and that science and art are both systems of bringing new things to light. And I think that that's what I really love about your Petri dish art, you know, that it really draws attention to the idea that we are always choosing, we're always framing what we're looking at in a particular way. And that is something that scientists often don't feel able to discuss, or that the lexicon of science, as you say, doesn't really accommodate. But it is definitely something that the two have in common.
This is true. I think another example of this will go back to the poet philosopher Novalis,
Okay.
um, who wrote a story about unrequited love or the loss of his loved one, and which was symbolized by the blue flower. And the blue flower has been something that scientists have never been able to create. They have tried many, many times. Many companies have gotten close by maybe creating a lavender version or a dark purple one. But here's the story about the blue flower symbolically representing the unattainable. And now scientists, hundreds of years later, are trying to use that story uh, to create a horticultural specimen. And the blue flower appears in many cultural compositions, such as Eyes Wide Shut, for example. There's a blue flower on one of the protagonists uh, dancing. Walter Benjamin mentions it, etc. So it's a symbol that continues in culture, has reached the point in science where it's still a mystery.
It's amazing. Yeah, how these images travel, and also the power of images to cross those boundaries, I think is really interesting. I noticed that you're featured in one of the books that I really relied on for my PhD, Epigenetic Landscapes by Susan Squire. I have it here. Yeah. Yeah. And that book, I mean, amongst other things, is about metaphors in science and how those allow practitioners from various fields to come together and to collaborate over a shared problem, which is again something art can really be a resource for. So
Absolutely. I think that many scientists desire to eliminate metaphor, but many do not. I mean, Stephen Jay Gould also talked about metaphor in science. I think what you have with Schrodinger, when he wrote What is Life, he uses the term code script, which gave Watson and Crick the idea of the code script of DNA. So metaphors can be very helpful in thinking about possibilities that normally you wouldn't associate as being on a continuum. And that's what artists do too. It's always about something connecting something to something else, to something else.
yeah, and I think that the example of the code of life, DNA, is really interesting here because, as you say, a metaphor can be enabling, and metaphors exist in science, whether scientists acknowledge that or not. They exist in science, but they also mark the limitations of what can be discussed and what can be known. And DNA is an interesting example there. I think the book I just mentioned really shows how the scientist Conrad Waddington was trying to expand the metaphors we use when talking about early human development or mammalian development beyond a gene coding for something, and raising many more questions around how development happens. So how does that feature in your work? I know you've done some work on genetics.
I've done work on genetics very early on, really in the late 1980s, before the first draft of the human genome. And I arrived at that through an exhibition I was having in which I attached kaleidoscopes onto a vessel, and you would look through this vessel with the kaleidoscope on it and look at a bowl of 1,000-year-old Chinese eggs. And
Mhm.
what you would see, depending on what angle you were looking, was a cell, a series of spheres, or even something else. So this idea of instrumentalized vision interested me now. So I went home and I retrieved my daughter's college biology book
Mhm.
and looked through it to find something that was microscopic, but not a disease. And that's how I came across the chromosome. It took me quite a while to figure out what metaphors the chromosome contains. You know, in Greek, the word chromosome means colored body. So there again is a metaphor, an anthropomorphization of these little bodies floating around. I had my own DNA tested to see what my chromosomes would look like. And then it struck me that chromosomes were the way the body writes itself, that it is a script, essentially, and that it relates to other scripts and alphabets as a way to create a story, a meaning, etc. And that's how I began to work on a series called Codex Genome in 1998. I did a whole series of silkscreen and painted pieces by employing the chromosome and the different kinds of letters, including Leonardo's backwards writing, some of the kinds of alphabets that were based in alternative languages. And what you see in this mix really is the way that this language in the body will tell you not who you are, but what you are. Okay. And I felt that that was a really important thing to look at. I later did another sculptural piece called Zoosemiotics, in which I actually built little sculptures of chromosomes. And you can tell, of course, by looking at the karyotype, whether it's a fish or a gorilla or a human, etc. And that struck me really as something that was to be the icon of the 21st century. Double helix, of course, was extremely popular. The double helix could not really have been seen until the atomic microscope was invented. So it was more of a diagram
Mhm.
as opposed to a material entity. And the kinds of language that one uses when describing genetic material was also something that interested me very much because it could mean lots of different things. So, for example, your chromosomes or is your DNA the blueprint of the body? Is it a family archive? Is it the deed to a body part farm? Is it something you own? All of these questions about describing what DNA is still floating around, particularly in light of the new technologies such as CRISPR and IVF, etc. So I don't think we have one answer. Maybe scientifically, it could say it is the hereditary material that is passed on, to use Dawkins' phrase, but it's also other things, because the meaning of chromosomes or DNA is also intricately entwined with how it's used. Okay? Is it something one can edit? Is it something one can sell? Is it a form of eugenics? These are some of the questions. Okay.
Yeah.
And I, I don't have any answers here, but I believe in all of that. And, I think before we had genetics at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, who published my book, The Molecular Gaze, Art in the Genetic Age, with Dorothy Nelkin, that was part of the Eugenics Institute. So we have a long history of looking at how we remake nature and what that means.
No, I think that's fascinating. And this idea that the metaphors we use to describe something like DNA determines how we imagine it could be used, shapes our understanding of the ways in which it should be used. And describing it as a code, I think, in that sense, has been misleading as something so abstracted, something that exists separately from us. So I think that's a really important point to make. And this idea about language as well leads me to the question, if we're talking about DNA as a story, and science in many ways as a collection of stories, who should be participating in the writing of those stories? Who should be contributing to shaping the language we use? And I guess that leads me to the question: who is your work for? Who's your audience?
Well, my audience is generally for a general public, because I show my work in museums and galleries. I've also lectured on my work in many august scientific establishments, whether Max Planck in a number of cities, or Embel in Rome, London School of Economics, even as part of the Wellcome Trust grant to Sarah Franklin for the ReproSoc Society. I was there several times. I think that DNA to a general audience is too abstract. To a general audience, I think that the conversation needs to be expanded. And I think that many conversations can go on simultaneously. One is the artistic interpretation of actually visualizing what it may be. Another is the scientific explanation of how it works. Another is the sociological explanation about how it affects society and people's lives. Another one is the science fiction aspect and filmic aspect. I had the honor of meeting Margaret Atwood this year, and certainly her novels revolve around the ways that reproduction are no longer an individual right.
Mm-hmm.
There is also the aspect of a legal interpretation. For example, I know that in some cases, birth certificates of babies born using IVF have the donated egg or surrogate mother on them as well. And then we have the filmic aspect like Gattaca, etc. And we have the philosophical aspect. Jürgen Habermas, for example, has written a book on this as well. So I don't think that we have one answer. I think we have this multitude of perspectives, and the technology is expanding much further and much faster than the way in which we can discern the ethics around it.
Yeah. And I think this is also such an important point to raise at a time like this, where many of us are feeling isolated and where conversations are perhaps not being had as broadly. The importance of, in the case of genetics, having multiple types of conversations and finding ways to kind of connect those, I think is really key. So I think it would be great to just finish off by talking a bit about the Bioart Lab, which was founded in 2011, and the work that you do there.
Yes, in 2011, we started the first bioart laboratory in a fine arts department in the United States. And it's a cross between a 19th century laboratory and a 21st century laboratory, in the sense that we have fish and coral and plants, and we also have molecular biology and things that require genetic interpretations or interference. We've done several projects there that have won awards. One was called the Mayo tomato, in which we inserted the gene of the protein myoglobin into a beefsteak tomato, which is a pun, to see if the tomato itself could provide protein for consumers to eliminate the cow. So it would be number one, a way to deal with climate change, and number two, it would allow consumers to grow their own. We also did another project called Soiled, and we tested about 50 or 60 soil samples throughout the 5 boroughs of New York City to find out what nutrients were in the different soils, and came up with a chart that looks like a Damien Hirst painting, a dot painting, except it's all data. And I think that showed us that people who live in New York City and are really interested in growing some of their own vegetables don't know what's in their soil. Okay. And some of it could be harmful as well. We did not test for toxins because basically that was beyond the scope of our project. But we won first place. We won a gold medal.
Wow.
For that one.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Sounds like like really important work you're doing, actually having an impact on your local community as well.
That's right. And I think that, what we try to do in the lab is use the tools of science to create art. So we're not operating by the scientific method. You do this, you do this, you do this. And we've actually discovered a couple of things. One is we have created a black agar, in
Wow.
which if you can paint with the phosphorescent material that one uses in the scientific laboratory, it's easier to see than if it's painted on clear gel. We've also hatched a number of baby skates, which was said couldn't be done in captivity.
Oh, wow.
So we did that a number of times. We've also introduced different techniques from molecular cuisine into the program. One piece in particular was an artist who collected her sweat and her tears and used artificial blood to create these round pellets, which if you touched a magnet, the pellets would all swirl around simultaneously.
Mm.
And one more project that was really outstanding was a project about the holy water in churches in Brooklyn and in Manhattan. And the artist in that case collected some of the holy water and sent it out to laboratories for analysis and found things that ranged from kiwi to tapeworms to other kinds of bacteria, etc., which of course had been known for a long time about the holy water, but this was a discrete artistic project that was physical and up on the wall. So that too was very interesting.
Wow. Such a range of projects you do. That's incredible. Well, I'm sure that after hearing about the Biolab, people want to check it out. Thanks so much for talking about your work with me today. I really appreciate it.